It began on a night when everything around Elvis Presley was rehearsed to perfection. Every light cue, every step, every joke timed to the second. The king of rock and roll had built an empire on control. Yet, what unfolded next wasn't in the script. Jerry Reed, that wiry Alabama picker with a grin like mischief itself, walked out holding a guitar that had already changed Elvis's life once before. The crowd thought it was a reunion, a sweet, on-stage gesture. They had no idea they were about to watch one of the few men who could still make Elvis nervous. Jerry didn't bow. He didn't even wait for the band to count him in. He reached down, plucked one sharp metallic note that sliced through the orchestra like lightning, and the whole machine froze. Elvis's eyes locked on him, not the practiced Vegas smile, something raw, surprise, maybe even fear, because Jerry was doing the one thing nobody did in Elvis's world. He was changing the plan, and for a few long seconds, time stalled. The audience couldn't tell if this was genius or disaster. The band didn't know whether to follow Jerry or wait for Elvis. Even the colonel's men backstage stopped breathing. Then, slowly, Elvis's mouth twitched. Not in anger, but recognition. Somewhere deep beneath the sequins and the headlines, a part of him was waking up. Tonight, Jerry Reed wasn't just playing guitar. He was reminding Elvis who he used to be. Long before that fateful night, before the rhinestones and the Vegas residencies, there was a song called Guitar Man. It was 1967, and Elvis was restless. The Hollywood years had drained the fire out of him. 3 movies a year, soundtracks turned out like factory noise, all safe, polished, forgettable. The same man who once made America gasp on the Milton Berle show now watched himself lip-sync love songs to cardboard sets. Fame had made him rich and bored. He wanted something that bit again, something that sounded like the South, like sweat and smoke. RCA handed him a demo from a Nashville writer named Jerry Reed Hubbard, a wild man who mixed country funk and lightning-fast picking that didn't sound like anyone else. The song was about a drifter who made his living playing for strangers. It was called Guitar Man. Elvis heard the first few bars and straightened in his chair. "That's it," he said. "That's what I've been looking for." But when they tried to record it, something was missing. The studio players couldn't catch that swampy groove on the demo. It was slick, polite, lifeless. Elvis's frustration boiled over. "Where's the guy who played this?" he demanded. "Get him." They called Jerry Reed. When Jerry arrived at RCA Studio B, he looked like he'd been pulled off a fishing boat, and in a way, he had. His hands were calloused, his grin reckless. He didn't look like anyone the Memphis Mafia would let pass the door. But Elvis's energy changed the moment he walked in. Jerry listened once, then said, "Y'all are doing it wrong." Nobody talked to Elvis's band that way, but Elvis laughed, a real laugh, the kind nobody had heard in months. "Then show us, man," he said. Jerry slung on his guitar, and within seconds, that missing heartbeat returned. He played the opening riff, snapping the strings like a whip, and suddenly, Elvis was alive again. No Hollywood director, no script, just groove. They cut Guitar Man in one take. When the playback ended, Elvis leaned back, eyes closed, smiling like a man who'd remembered his name. That session bonded them in a way no handshake could. Elvis respected people who spoke the language of instinct. Jerry wasn't impressed by the fame. He was impressed by the feel. He treated Elvis like another player in the circle, not a king on a throne, and for that, Elvis admired him. But admiration and comfort aren't the same. As the years rolled on, Elvis's world became a fortress. Vegas contracts, security handlers, every risk was ironed out, every set list frozen in time. The Colonel's motto was simple: no surprises. That rule kept the empire stable, and it slowly strangled the man inside it. By 1972, Jerry had become a name in his own right. He'd written hits for others, played sessions that defined Nashville's new sound, even scored movie roles. Still, when word spread that Elvis wanted to see him in Vegas, he didn't hesitate. "Tell the boy I'll bring my pick," he said. What Elvis didn't tell him was that the show wasn't built for improvisers. Every cue ran like clockwork. Horns, strings, backup singers, jokes rehearsed to the breath. To the fans, it looked effortless. To Elvis, it was prison choreography. When Jerry arrived at rehearsal, one of the stage managers pulled him aside. "Just follow the script, okay? He likes things tight." Jerry nodded, but his grin widened. That night, backstage before the curtain rose, Elvis was pacing, shaking his hands, psyching himself into the familiar rhythm. Jerry leaned against an amp, tuning lazily. "You ready, son?" Elvis asked, half smiling. Jerry looked up, born ready. "But tell me something. Mind if I kick it off myself?" Elvis blinked. The set list didn't allow for that. Every entrance, every chord, was locked in place. "You want to start it alone?" "Just the first lick," Jerry said. "Let it breathe a second before the train leaves the station." Elvis hesitated, then chuckled. "Man, you always gotta stir something, do you? Somebody's gotta remind these folks it's music, not math." The orchestra laughed. Elvis did too. But the sound carried a warning. Still, he couldn't say no, not to Jerry, because deep down he missed that danger. The show opened as usual. Bright lights, screams, brass exploding through the first medley. Elvis was in full command, tossing scarves, grinning, feeding the crowd. Then, midway through the set, he announced a special guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, my buddy, the one and only Jerry Reed." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Jerry strode out, boots heavy, guitar gleaming. He shook Elvis's hand, whispered something that made Elvis grin, and turned to the crowd. Elvis stepped back, expecting Jerry to wait for the band's cue. Instead, Jerry adjusted his strap, looked at the conductor, and said calmly, "Hold up a second." He hit one sharp E string and let it ring. The horns froze. The drummer's sticks hovered mid-air. Then Jerry started playing, slow at first, deliberate, that swamp funk rhythm sliding like oil over gravel. It was Guitar Man the way Elvis recorded it. It was Guitar Man the way Jerry wrote it. Raw, unfinished, alive. The crowd didn't know whether to clap yet. Elvis's jaw tightened. He could feel the Colonel's eyes boring into the back of his neck. This wasn't in the plan. But when Jerry's voice came in, half singing, half laughing, something electric rippled through the room. "Well, I quit my job down at the car wash." It wasn't rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was freedom for the sake of art. Elvis felt it, instantly. That rhythm hit him in the chest like a flashback to Sun Records, the smell of hot tubes, the thrill of no rules. For a heartbeat, he wasn't a brand. He was a man with a mic. Still, he couldn't let go completely. The old instinct screamed, "You're losing control." The machine that kept him alive, the managers, the contracts, the myth, depended on predictability. The crowd, however, was leaning forward, sensing that this was real, that this was danger. They'd seen Elvis perform thousands of times, but tonight they were watching him feel. And Jerry knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't trying to humiliate Elvis. He was giving him a doorway back to the part of himself that fame had buried. Behind the curtain, the Colonel's voice could be heard low and furious. "What's he doing? Get him off!" But Elvis raised a hand, just a small gesture to the conductor. "Don't move." For the first time in years, he didn't know what came next, and it thrilled him. As Jerry slid into the second verse, the rhythm deepened. Elvis watched, smiling wider now, nodding to the beat. A few musicians joined in, hesitant, testing the waters. The sound grew rougher, warmer, alive. Somewhere in the middle of that verse, Elvis laughed. Not the entertainer's laugh. The boy from Tupelo laugh. The one that used to echo through Sam Phillips's studio when the tape first started rolling. The audience felt it. They erupted in cheers. The tension broke, but only on the surface. Inside, Elvis's pulse was racing because he knew what this meant. Jerry had just proven that spontaneity still worked. That all the polish and control might have been the cage, not the crown. When the song ended, the room was chaos, half applause, half disbelief. Elvis hugged Jerry, grinning for the cameras. "You son of a gun," he whispered, still catching his breath. But backstage, the storm was already brewing. The Colonel's face was pale. "What was that?" he hissed. "You let him hijack the show." Elvis didn't answer. He was staring at his hands, the same hands that had once gripped a guitar like it was oxygen. For a fleeting moment, he'd felt that again, and that scared him more than any manager ever could. Because if he could still feel it, he'd have to admit how long he'd been numb. As Jerry packed up his guitar, one of the stagehands approached him nervously. "Man, you weren't supposed to do that." Jerry just smiled. Then maybe they were supposed to remember it. He slung the strap over his shoulder, winked, and walked out into the neon night, leaving behind a man who suddenly realized that perfection had a price. And tonight, it was his peace of mind. Elvis didn't sleep. Not the kind of restless tossing that came with a noisy hallway or a bad meal. This was different. This was the kind of insomnia that shows up when a truth walks into your room and refuses to leave. He lay there hearing Jerry Reed's guitar over and over, like the strings had carved a message into the air. Not just notes, not just rhythm, a reminder, because for a few minutes on that stage, the whole Vegas machine had cracked, and Elvis had felt what the cracks smelled like. Freedom. By morning, the story had already begun to mutate. Some people called it a fun moment. Others described it like a small rebellion. A few even whispered the word hijack, like Jerry had committed a crime. And the people who protected Elvis the most, they didn't care what it felt like. They cared what it looked like. Backstage, a quiet meeting happened that wasn't on any schedule. No microphones, no fans, just tight faces and controlled voices. Men who didn't know music, but knew money, explaining to Elvis why that moment could not become a habit. Because once a crowd realizes something is real, they start wanting more real. And real is messy. Real can't be timed. Real can't be insured. Elvis listened, nodding along at the right moments, wearing that calm expression he'd mastered over years of being told what was best. But inside him, something was grinding. When they finished talking, one of them asked carefully, Do you want us to tell Jerry not to do that again?" Elvis hesitated, and that hesitation was the most dangerous thing in the room because he wanted to say yes. He also wanted to say no. He wanted to be protected, and he wanted to be exposed. He finally shrugged like it didn't matter. "Jerry's Jerry," he said. "He ain't trying to hurt nothing." But the way Elvis said, it wasn't a defense. It was a confession. Later that day, Jerry Reed was sitting in a quiet corner, half laughing as he watched people react to the night before like it was a scandal. He kept it light. He always kept it light. But he wasn't stupid. He knew he'd pushed a door open. And he knew Elvis lived in a house where certain doors stayed locked for a reason. When Elvis walked in, the room changed instantly. Not because Elvis tried to make it change. It just did. The air rearranged itself around him the way it always did. But there was something new in his face now. Not anger, not joy, something in between. Elvis sat down slower than usual, like his body was carrying a thought that weighed too much. Jerry grinned. "Well, you still got a roof over your head. Guess I didn't get you fired." Elvis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You about did," he said. Jerry waved it off. Ain't nothing wrong with a little surprise. Elvis looked at him quietly. Surprises cost money around here. Jerry leaned in like he was sharing a joke. Then you're in a very expensive prison, buddy. That landed. Elvis's smile faded. He glanced away like he was looking for an exit inside his own mind. It ain't a prison, he said, but his voice didn't have conviction. It sounded like something he was supposed to say. Jerry's tone softened. You don't got to explain nothing to me, E. Elvis nodded, relieved that Jerry wasn't pushing further. Then out of nowhere, he asked, Why'd you do it? Jerry blinked. Do what? You know what? Elvis said. His voice was quiet. Why'd you stop the band like that? Jerry shrugged. 'Cause you weren't listening yet. Elvis glanced up sharply. I was listening. Jerry didn't flinch. He just held his gaze. You were performing. There's a difference. That hit like a slap. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. And accuracy was the one thing Elvis couldn't fight with charm. For a moment, Elvis's face tightened, the defensive pride rising like a shield. Then the shield dropped, because deep down, Elvis knew a secret no fan could understand. He didn't fear being embarrassed. He feared being seen. Not as a king, as a tired man. A man who still loved the sound of a guitar more than he loved any applause. A man who'd been forced to treat music like a job instead of a pulse. Elvis turned his rings slowly, spinning them on his fingers as if he could wind himself back in time. I used to feel it, he said, almost to himself. Like, I used to feel it before I even opened my mouth. Jerry nodded. I know. Elvis let out a short breath. Now it's like... He stopped. He didn't finish. He didn't want to admit the word numb. Jerry didn't rescue him from it. He let the silence sit, because silence makes a man either run or tell the truth. Elvis's voice dropped lower. Sometimes I get up there, and I can see it. All of it. The lights, the people, the band, the pretty noise, and I feel like I'm watching myself do it. Jerry's eyes didn't judge. They just stayed kind. That's why I did it, Jerry said. I wanted you to stop watching and start living again, even if it was just for a minute. Elvis swallowed. The muscles in his jaw twitched. You got nerve, he muttered. Jerry smiled. You liked it. Elvis didn't answer right away. He could have denied it. He could have laughed it off. He could have thrown a joke like a smoke bomb and escaped. But he didn't. He just stared down at his hands again. And pressure built in that room like a storm gathering without rain. Because Elvis was now stuck between two painful truths. If he admitted Jerry was right, he'd have to admit the machine had taken something precious from him. But if he denied Jerry was right, he'd be lying to the only man in the room who didn't need anything from him. Elvis finally looked up. Don't do that to me again on my own stage, he said. The words were sharp, but his eyes weren't. Jerry raised both hands, surrendering like it was playful. All right, Elvis leaned forward, voice rougher now. I mean it, Jerry. I see. He stopped again, his mouth open like he was about to confess something dangerous. I can't handle how good it feels. But the sentence never fully formed. He stood up, pacing. They'll make it a thing, he said. They'll talk. They'll say I'm losing it. They'll say I'm slipping. Jerry's grin faded. You worry too much about them. Elvis looked at him with a flash of frustration. You don't understand. You go back to your life. I stay here. That sentence carried more pain than the words admitted. Jerry didn't clap back. He didn't tell Elvis to be free like it was easy. He just nodded slowly. I know, Jerry said. That's why I did it carefully. Elvis frowned. Carefully? Jerry leaned forward. I didn't try to steal nothing. I didn't try to make you look bad. I didn't do it to show off. I did it so the room would hear what you are again. Elvis stared at him, skeptical. And what am I? Jerry said it like it was obvious. A singer who wants to be a musician. That stung because Elvis had spent years being treated like something else. A product, a symbol, a machine that printed screams and money. And the worst part was that Elvis had learned to cooperate with it. Not because he was weak, but because he was tired. Because cooperation kept the peace. But Jerry wasn't here to keep the peace. Jerry was here to remind Elvis what peace used to feel like. That conversation would have ended there, quiet and heavy, if not for the knock at the door. A man stepped in, polite smile, eyes calculating, one of the protectors, the kind of person who talked softly while tightening the leash. He glanced at Jerry like Jerry was a dent in a shiny car. "Mr. Reed," he said, friendly but flat. "We loved having you. Incredible moment. Just let's keep things consistent from here." Jerry smiled, like he didn't notice the threat. "Consistent. Good." The man turned to Elvis, waiting for reinforcement. "Right, Elvis?" Elvis nodded slowly, but his nod looked wrong. It looked like a man agreeing to something he hated. Jerry watched that nod. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The whole room could feel the disappointment sink through Elvis's shoulders like wet fabric. The man left, and suddenly, Elvis wasn't just tired. He was embarrassed. Not because Jerry made a bold move on stage, because Elvis had just submitted in front of Jerry. And Jerry was the kind of man who'd never submit to anyone when it came to music. Elvis's voice came out cold. "You happy now?" Jerry's eyebrows lifted. "What?" "You came in here." Stirred up the water. Made him nervous. Elvis said. The words sounded like anger, but the tone underneath sounded like shame. "Now I got to go out there and act like everything's fine." Jerry didn't rise to it. He just stood still. "You always act like everything's fine." Elvis's nostrils flared. He turned away, fists clenching. "You don't know what it's like." Jerry's voice lowered. "Then, show me." That was the moment the tension snapped into the next phase. Because Jerry wasn't backing down. Not because he wanted a fight. Because he cared. And being cared about is terrifying when you've built your life around being controlled. Elvis spun back, eyes blazing. "I don't need saving," he said. Jerry nodded. "I didn't say you did." Elvis shot back. "Then what are you doing?" Jerry took a step closer, careful, like approaching a skittish animal. "I'm reminding you," he said, "that you still got it, that you still feel it." Elvis's voice cracked just slightly. "And what if I do?" Jerry's face softened. "Then you'll have to decide what you're going to do with that." Elvis froze. Because that was the real danger. Not the colonel, not the headlines, not the schedule. The danger was choice. If he still felt the real thing, then he couldn't hide behind the story, that he was trapped forever. He'd have to admit that some part of the cage was also habit, comfort, fear, and that realization could break a man. Elvis turned away again, and his voice dropped into something almost boyish. "I miss it," he admitted, barely louder than a whisper. Jerry didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He didn't say, "I told you." He just said, "I know." Elvis swallowed hard. "I miss when it was just a room, a guitar, and something to prove." His hand moved unconsciously, like he was reaching for a guitar that wasn't there. Jerry nodded. "You can still have that. Not all the time, but sometimes." Elvis shook his head like he was arguing with himself. Sometimes ain't enough. That line hung heavy because it wasn't about music anymore. It was about life. About the way Elvis had been forced to accept small pieces of joy like crumbs, then pretend those crumbs were a feast. Jerry picked up his guitar case slowly. "I ain't going to push you," he said. "But I'm going to tell you something before I go." Elvis didn't look at him. Jerry's voice was calm. "Last night when I started that song, I watched you, and for a second, you weren't the king." Elvis's jaw tightened. Jerry continued. You were a kid again. And I saw you miss that kid so much it scared you. Elvis finally looked up, eyes sharp. Don't you talk about me like you know me. Jerry nodded gently. I don't know everything, but I know music, and music don't lie. Elvis stood perfectly still, like he'd been pinned to the floor. Then, softly, almost unwillingly, he said, It felt good. Jerry smiled, not triumphant. Relieved. Yeah, he said. It did. Elvis held his gaze for a long moment, and in that look was a whole war. Pride versus hunger, control versus truth. Finally, Elvis's shoulders dropped. Thank you, he said. The words quiet, almost shameful. Jerry nodded once. You're welcome. He turned toward the door, and just before he stepped out, Elvis spoke again, voice sharper, like he needed to hide the softness under a warning. But don't do that to me again. Jerry paused, didn't turn around, just smiled to himself, because he understood what Elvis was really saying. Don't remind me of what I've lost. Don't make me want it again. Jerry opened the door and left, and Elvis stood alone in the quiet that followed, realizing something he couldn't unlearn now. The machine could protect his image, but it couldn't protect him from himself. Not after the night Jerry Reed broke the rules and proved Elvis was still listening. The strangest part wasn't that Jerry Reed left, it was how quiet it got after he did. Elvis had lived his entire adult life surrounded by sound. Screams, horns, laughter, phones ringing, men talking over each other like the world would end if they paused for 3 seconds. Silence should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like standing in front of a mirror you didn't ask for, because Jerry didn't walk out like a guest who'd had his fun. He walked out like a man who had just said something true and knew the truth would keep echoing long after the door shut. Elvis paced the room, then stopped. He sat, then stood again. I filled. Efter. Cost. K. He went to the window and stared down at lights that looked like diamonds from far away and like cages up close. His mind kept replaying the same moment on stage, not as a highlight, but as a question. Why did it feel like breathing? That's what scared him. Not the colonel's irritation, not the staff's tense smiles, not the whispers that a guest had stepped out of line. The fear was simpler and sharper. A part of Elvis had been starving, and Jerry had accidentally fed it. Now the hunger was awake. That afternoon, the machine went back to doing what it did best, turning emotion into schedule. There was another show, another crowd, another set of expectations, and Elvis knew how to wear the crown, even when it felt heavy. But the problem with waking up is you can't pretend you're still asleep. Before he went back out, Elvis's people did that thing they always did when he got quiet, talked around him, like their words could build a wall between him and his own thoughts. Somebody joked, somebody offered a pill, somebody brought a doctor's opinion without being asked. All of it was comfort disguised as control. Elvis smiled at the right moments. He nodded. He said, aha, like he was listening. Inside, he wasn't listening to them. He was listening to a guitar he couldn't hear anymore. When it was time, Elvis walked toward the stage with the same posture the world expected. Back straight, chin up, shoulders carrying history. But right before he stepped through the curtain, he paused for half a second longer than normal. Not long enough for the crowd to notice. Long enough for Elvis to notice, because he knew what he was about to do. He was about to go back to the version of himself that never surprised anyone. And for the first time in a long time, he hated that version. The show roared to life. Elvis moved through the early numbers with the usual precision, but something in his eyes looked different. His jokes landed, but they didn't lift him the same way. His smile flashed, then faded faster. He was present, but not fully. The audience was still screaming. They always screamed, but Elvis had stopped letting the screams tell him he was okay. Halfway through, there was a moment where the band hit a familiar cue, one of those clean transitions that kept the whole thing running smooth. And Elvis felt it. That smoothness, that safety, that cage. He turned his head slightly toward the bandstand, like he was checking if the door was still there. Not Jerry's door, the other door. The one that led back to rawness, back to risk, back to a moment that could fall apart and still be real. He didn't open it. Not that night, but the fact that he wanted to. That was the crack turning into a fracture. After the show, the fallout got sharper. The Colonel didn't explode like fans imagine. The Colonel didn't need to raise his voice. His power didn't live in volume. It lived in consequences. Elvis sat in a private room while the Colonel's people floated in and out, carrying messages like they were carrying weapons. One man said gently, "We need to keep the show consistent." Another added, "The press can twist these moments." A third said what they really meant. Nobody gets to make Elvis look uncertain. That word uncertain hit Elvis like an insult, because they weren't protecting him from scandal. They were protecting the myth from humanity. Elvis leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling like it had answers. He'd learned a long time ago that arguing only makes them tighten the leash harder. He was too tired for war. But Jerry's voice had done something dangerous. It had given Elvis a new kind of anger. Not loud anger, a quiet disgust, the kind you feel when you realize you've been cooperating with your own disappearance. Someone asked Elvis, "Do you want Jerry invited back tomorrow?" Elvis didn't answer right away. The room awaited. This wasn't a casual question. It was a loyalty test, a choice between comfort and honesty. Elvis finally said, "Not tomorrow." The men nodded, relieved. Then Elvis added slower, "And don't call him about it." That part confused them, because Elvis wasn't just declining. He was protecting Jerry. Or maybe he was protecting himself from needing Jerry again. Later, alone again, Elvis did what he always did when he couldn't stand his own thoughts. He reached for something to soften them. Maybe it was a drink. Maybe it was a pill. Maybe it was a phone call to someone who would talk about anything except the truth. But whatever he reached for, it didn't work the way it used to. Because now there was a sharp little splinter lodged in his mind. You were performing. There's a difference. The next day, people around Elvis acted like the Jerry Reed moment had never happened. They treated it like a funny story, something you file away like a souvenir. Elvis played along, but he noticed something that made the whole thing worse. A few of the musicians were different. They were looser, livelier. They tasted the danger too, not the danger of scandal, the danger of music that could surprise you. And once musicians taste that, they start craving it. Elvis saw a drummer add a little extra snap. He heard a guitarist push a phrase just slightly ahead of the beat. Tiny things, nothing the audience would catch. But Elvis caught it. And instead of being angry, he felt something like grief, because even the band was beginning to remember what it felt like to actually play. That grief turned into something heavier, a jealousy that surprised even him. Not jealousy of Jerry's talent, jealousy of Jerry's freedom. Jerry Reed got to walk back into his life after stirring the water. Elvis had to stay in the pool, and that jealousy made Elvis harsh. Not to the fans, not to the press, to the people closest to him. A quick word spoken too sharply. A joke that cut instead of landed. A stare that made the room go quiet. Because when a man can't fight the real enemy, he starts swinging at shadows. By that evening, Elvis's suite had become what it always became when his mood turned dark. Half waiting room, half confessional. Men hovered. Friends joked too loudly. Someone played music to fill the air. Elvis sat in the middle of it, alone like a king in a crowded throne room, surrounded yet alone. Then the phone rang. A simple ring, but everything in the room tensed because the phone didn't represent communication. It represented obligation. Elvis stared at it. He knew what the call would be. Confirmation that tomorrow's show was locked. Confirmation that the machine was still the machine. He picked it up and listened. His face stayed neutral, but his eyes hardened. When he hung up, he didn't say a word for a long moment. Finally, he muttered almost like he was talking to himself. They don't want music. They want routine. One of the guys laughed like it was a joke. Yeah, well, routine pays. Elvis looked at him with a flash of something cold. Routine kills, Elvis said. The room fell quiet because that wasn't a line. That was a truth. And once Elvis said it out loud, he couldn't pretend it was just a thought anymore. That night, Elvis did something he rarely did in those years. He reached for a guitar, not to perform, not to show off, not to impress anybody, just to feel the wood under his fingers and see if there was still a pulse there. He played softly, the way people play when they're alone and not trying to be anything but honest. A few men in the room watched like they were witnessing something private they weren't invited into. Elvis didn't care. He played a few chords, then stopped. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, from emotion, because he realized something that made his throat tighten. He didn't trust himself to feel good things anymore. Good things had consequences. Good things woke hunger, and hunger in his world was dangerous. One of the guys tried to lighten the mood, sounding good. Elvis didn't smile. He stared at the guitar like it was a letter from a past self he'd abandoned. He set it down slowly and whispered almost inaudible, I used to be better than this. Nobody knew what to say to that, because they couldn't fix it. They couldn't distract it. They couldn't medicate it. They couldn't schedule it away. But they couldn't fix the heartbreak of a man realizing he'd been living as a symbol instead of a person. And that's where the darkest truth surfaced. Not as gossip, not as sensational tragedy, but as something more haunting. Elvis didn't fear being upstaged. He feared being reminded that he still cared, because caring meant pain. Caring meant longing. Caring meant admitting he was still alive inside a life that had become a loop. In the days that followed, the Jerry Reed moment became a quiet ghost that haunted Elvis in small ways. A riff he heard in his head. A pause in the show where he almost broke out of the script. A laugh that wanted to be real but got swallowed. And every time Elvis swallowed it, he felt smaller. Eventually, Elvis asked a friend casually, "Where's Jerry at?" The friend answered like it was nothing. "He's gone back home working." Elvis nodded like he didn't care. But his eyes drifted away and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Good," he said. "He don't need this mess." That line sounded like kindness. It was also something else. It was Elvis admitting that his world wasn't just heavy. It was contagious. And the worst part, it wasn't the Colonel who built it. It was years of everyone feeding the myth until the myth became the only safe version of Elvis allowed to exist. One late night, Elvis finally did what he tried not to do. He called Jerry. Not a flashy call, not a comeback and save the show call. A quiet call, the kind of call a man makes when he's trying to sound normal while standing on the edge of a truth. Jerry answered, cheerful as ever. "Well, look who remembered my number." Elvis chuckled weakly. "You got a big mouth, boy." Jerry laughed. "You calling to fuss at me?" Elvis paused, and that pause said everything Jerry needed to know. Jerry's voice softened. "You all right, E?" Elvis swallowed. "I don't know," he admitted. Jerry didn't rush in with advice. He didn't preach. He didn't try to rescue him. He just said, "I'm here." Elvis let out a breath that sounded like a man finally setting down something heavy. Then his expression hardened again, the pride returning like armor. "Listen," Elvis said. Don't do that to me again. Not like that. Jerry's voice stayed gentle. I won't, unless you ask me to. Elvis didn't answer because the truth was part of him wanted to ask. Part of him wanted someone to walk out and break the rules until Elvis remembered himself completely. But another part of him was terrified. Terrified of what he'd have to change if he admitted he wanted that. Elvis ended the call with a few casual words, like he was closing a business conversation. But after he hung up, he sat in the quiet for a long time. Then he whispered to nobody the sentence that summed up the entire fallout. I can't keep doing this forever. And that was the punch. Not because he meant he wanted to quit Vegas. Not because he meant he wanted to cancel shows. Because for the first time, Elvis said out loud what he'd been avoiding for years. The machine could keep him famous, but it could not keep him whole. And once a man realizes he's not whole, he starts looking for the part of himself that got left behind. Even if finding it costs him everything. Years passed, and the story didn't die the way most backstage moments die. It didn't fade into a joke told over drinks. It didn't get buried under bigger headlines. It lived in a quieter place, where the real Elvis stories always survive among musicians. Because musicians don't just remember what happened, they remember what it sounded like. And the night Jerry Reed stopped the machine for a few seconds, that became one of those stories passed between players like a secret handshake. Not because it was scandalous, because it was true. Elvis Presley, the most controlled man in entertainment, got surprised on his own stage and didn't shut it down. That's what made it unforgettable. Not Jerry's boldness, Elvis's hesitation. That tiny pause right at the edge of control was the closest thing to a confession Elvis ever gave in public. And it's tempting to romanticize that moment, to turn it into a neat little tale about two friends, music and laughter. But neat isn't honest. Honest is complicated. Honest is a man who loved music so much, it rescued him, and then watched success wrap that same music in rules until it became a performance he had to survive. Honest is Elvis standing on a stage built for perfection, realizing perfection feels like drowning. Because Guitar Man wasn't just a song title. It was a version of Elvis that still existed somewhere underneath the costume. A version of him that didn't need fireworks, jokes, or the right camera angle. Just a groove, just a band, just the truth. That's why Jerry Reed's One Thing punched so hard. He didn't just change an intro. He changed the temperature of the room. He reminded everyone, Elvis included, that the crown wasn't the source of Elvis's power. The music was. And when you start thinking about Elvis through that lens, the whole myth tilts. Most people talk about Elvis like he was either unstoppable or doomed. Like he was either a king who had it all, or a tragedy who lost everything. But the truth is more human, and that's what makes it harder to face. Elvis wasn't one thing. He was two things at once. He was a man who craved freedom, and a man who built a life where freedom felt impossible. He was the singer who made the world shake, and the exhausted performer who learned how to smile through numbness. He was the kid from Tupelo who'd stay up late talking about gospel harmonies, and the global icon who couldn't walk into a grocery store without becoming a headline. So when Jerry came in with that guitar and broke the rule, he didn't embarrass Elvis. He forced Elvis to feel a question he'd been dodging for years. If the real thing is still inside me, why am I living like it's not? That question doesn't sound dangerous to regular people. To Elvis, it was dynamite, because it didn't just challenge the show, it challenged the system that kept him afloat. And once that question gets loud enough, you start hearing it everywhere. In the quiet after the crowd leaves, in the moments between songs, in the way you reach for comfort that doesn't comfort anymore. That's where legacy begins, not in statues or documentaries. In the private battles a person fights when nobody's watching. Here's what makes the Jerry Reed moment feel like prophecy now. It showed us that Elvis wasn't out of emotion. He wasn't out of soul. He wasn't out of love for the craft. He was out of room, out of space, to be messy without consequences, out of permission to be imperfect. That's the part people forget. Elvis didn't die because he stopped caring. If anything, the tragedy is that he cared too much and couldn't find a safe way to live with that care. Because caring makes you want. Caring makes you dream. Caring makes you notice the difference between what you're doing and what you wish you were doing. And in Elvis's world, wishing was dangerous. Wishing led to conflict. Conflict led to pressure. Pressure led to the things he used to smooth himself out. And the smoother he got, the less he could feel. That's the loop. That's the trap. And Jerry Reed accidentally poked a hole in it. If you've ever wondered why certain Elvis stories hit harder than others, it's because the best stories don't make him look perfect. They make him look real. They show the moments where the mask slipped and we saw what it cost him to keep it on. The Jerry Reed moment was one of those slips because it wasn't staged vulnerability. It wasn't a planned human moment. It was a surprise, and surprises are the only thing that can expose what a person is truly protecting. Elvis's world expected him to be in charge of everything. Yet, for a brief spark of time, he let someone else steer the feeling of the room. That's not weakness. That's trust. And trust doesn't grow in a cage. That's why the story matters now. Not because it proves Jerry was bold, because it proves Elvis still had a door inside him that could open. Even late, even tired, even surrounded by people who wanted consistency more than truth. It's easy to assume Elvis was trapped by other people. The Colonel, the contracts, the demands, the myths, those things were real. But the older you get, the more you realize something uncomfortable. Some cages are built from outside pressure. Others are built from inside fear. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of losing what you've already earned. Fear of admitting you're unhappy. Fear of changing. And Elvis, for all his power, was still a man who had everything to lose. So he stayed. He performed. He smiled. He kept the machine running. But nights like that one, the night Jerry Reed broke the rule, proved that Elvis wasn't blind to what was happening. He knew. That's the haunting part. He knew the difference between music that lives and music that sells. He knew the difference between applause and peace. He knew the difference between being loved and being managed. And he felt the gap widening. When you think about it that way, the story stops being about a single night. It becomes a symbol, a snapshot of Elvis standing at a crossroads in his own spirit. One road was the familiar safety of the script. The other road was messy and unpredictable, but alive. Jerry Reed didn't force Elvis to take that second road. He simply stood at the entrance and pointed. And Elvis, just for a minute, looked down that road like he could see himself again. If you want a final twist, it's this. The most unexpected thing Jerry Reed did on stage wasn't stopping the band. It was giving Elvis permission. Not permission from the Colonel, not permission from management, permission from a fellow musician who didn't care about the myth, permission to be nothing but a man with a song. And that kind of permission can feel like a gift or a threat. To Elvis, it was both, because once someone reminds you who you are, you can't unknow it. You can drown it out. You can numb it. You can schedule it away, but it stays there waiting. That's why the story lingers, because it leaves us with an uncomfortable human question. How many times did Elvis feel that spark and then have to bury it to keep the world happy? How many nights did he walk off stage smiling while something inside him begged to be simpler again? How many times did he pick up a guitar in private and wonder when it stopped feeling like home? Quote, "We don't get to rewrite Elvis's life." Quote, quote, quote. We don't get to rescue him in hindsight, but we do get to see him more clearly, not as a flawless idol, not as a doomed headline, as a man who still had music in him even when life gave him fewer and fewer places to put it. And that changes the way you hear his legacy. Because the legacy isn't only the records. It's the struggle behind them. It's the moments he almost broke free. It's the brief flashes where the kid from Tupelo still showed up, even under all that weight. Jerry Reed didn't steal Elvis's spotlight. He held up a match in a dark room and proved the air could still catch fire. And Elvis, God help him, recognized the flame. He just couldn't keep it burning. Not in that world. Not for long. But the fact that he felt it at all, that means Elvis Presley never fully disappeared into the costume. He was still inside there listening, waiting for the right note to remind him who he was. And once you understand that, you stop asking whether Elvis was a king. You start asking what it cost him to stay one. If this story made you hear Elvis differently, hit like and subscribe, because we're digging up the moments that don't make the headlines. The moments that reveal the man behind the myth. And I want to know what you think. Was Jerry Reed disrespectful for breaking the rules? Or was he the only kind of friend Elvis could still trust? Someone brave enough to wake him up? Drop your take in the comments.